Hello, I am Lawrence Holgate, and this is episode 2 of Understanding John Stuart Mill, his classic book, Utilitarianism. And if you have the book, you can, that is, I'm talking about my book now, called Understanding John Stuart Mill. You can follow along as I read and make comments. That is, I make comments. And if you don't have the book, you can get it now at Amazon.com. Go to my website, holgatebooks.com. And by the way, you can pick up a free book there called Understanding Philosophy. I give it to all of my subscribers to the website. And so let's start with the episode 2. And we're going to use Mill's own title to that chapter, General Remarks, because what he's doing here in this chapter is simply introducing you to the subject and why he thinks it's so serious and so important. So let's get started. It's in chapter 1 of my book, General Remarks. Mill begins by reflecting on what he calls the little progress that has been made by philosophers about the criterion of right and wrong, and by that he means the standard of right and wrong. He writes that the debate has been going on for more than 2,000 years, and he says that the same schools of thought are still locked in a vigorous warfare about the foundations of morality. Mill points out that the controversy, or as the British say, controversy, about first principles is not unique to philosophy. There's similar debate that goes on in the sciences, including mathematics, but unlike the debate in philosophy, the outcome of the debates in the sciences doesn't impair the trustworthiness of the conclusions of those sciences. And that's because the, quote, the doctrines of a science are not usually deduced from, nor do they depend on their evidence upon what are called its first principles. And I'm quoting from Mill here, the relation of the first principles of a science is not that of foundations to an edifice, that is, to a building, but of roots to a tree, which may perform their office equally well, though they be never dug down to and exposed to light. An interesting comparison, isn't it? In other words, Mill is saying we can get along perfectly well in science without ever contemplating or even knowing about the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, if you know about these at all. Science may depend on them, you've got to use them, but no one needs to dig down to the roots of a tree to find them. His examples, as I've just said, of first principles of science, and these are also known as laws of thought, if you want to look it up. First, the law of identity, which simply is whatever is. The law of non-contradiction, nothing can both be and not be. I'll repeat that. It's the law of non-contradiction. Nothing can both be and not be. And then finally, the law of excluded middle. Everything must either be or not be. And those are the laws of science. But that's not the case when making a moral judgment. Let's get away from science for a minute and talk about moral judgments and the criterion of right and wrong. Again, another quote from Mill. All action is for the sake of some end, and rules of action, it seems natural to suppose, must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient. A test of right and wrong must be the means, one would think, of ascertaining what is right or wrong, and not a consequence of having already ascertained it. So to decide whether an action is right or wrong, for example, I asked the question, would it be wrong to break my promise to my friend to visit her in the hospital? If I want to decide whether that would be wrong, I need a test or a rule of right and wrong to answer that question. For example, the rule, one ought not to break a promise. We use moral rules to judge whether what we do is right or wrong. We do not say that breaking a promise is wrong and then create or attempt to create a general rule to justify what we did. Instead, we just use an existing general rule as a means of ascertaining that what we did is right or wrong. I know that in our culture it is wrong to break a promise unless you have extraordinary exceptions, and so we declare if you don't have those exceptions, that what you did is wrong. But Mill is saying more than this. He's saying that the first principles of morals in legislation have the same foundational role as moral rules. These first principles, as proposed by all theories of ethics, are the foundations, the means from which moral rules that you and I use every day are derived. And Mill claims that the first principles of morals in legislation, these are the foundations to a building, or an edifice, as he says. Unlike the first principles of science, they don't perform their office unless they are exposed to light. Only when we expose them will we be able to make rational moral judgments. And so some examples of first principles of morals, you may have read some of these. The famous Immanuel Kant says one ought to act only in accordance with a maxim that one can at the same time will to be a universal law. I said that a little quickly, and I won't explain it right now. We're going to talk about it later. John Locke, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And finally, John Stuart Mill, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. We'll be discussing all of these later on. Now, Mill goes on now to say in another section, we're in the same chapter, but he says there's a distinction between what he calls intuitive and inductive ways of knowing. The schools of thought to which he referred earlier are the intuitive and the inductive, and both schools agree on the necessity of general laws, but they disagree completely on their evidence and the source from which they derive their authority. Most philosophers today, by the way, prefer to use the word deontological and consequentialism for the names of the contending ethical theories. We no longer use the words intuitive and inductive for the way in which one claims to know that the law in question is true or false. So an intuitive school of thought is now called the deontological school of thought, and today the inductive school of thought is known with other terms like consequentialism, in which only the consequences of an action are relevant to making a moral judgment. More about that later. But let's talk about the intuitive school. It's very interesting. And it's still around, folks. There are two branches of the intuitive school. The first branch claims that everyone has a natural faculty, a sense of instinct that allows them to perceive that particular actions are right or wrong, pretty much in the same way that we hear the sound of a bell or see the first light of morning. A sense of instinct, a natural faculty. Without telling us why this popular theory would be rejected by anyone with a pretension to philosophy, that's what Mill says, Mill quickly moves on to a discussion of a second branch of intuitionist theory. This version says that we have a natural faculty that allows us to discern not what is right or wrong in particular cases, but only what general principles of moral judgment are true or false. General principles. We're shifting from calling an act right or wrong to the general principles which justify the actions. Moral intuition, quote, is a branch of our reason, not of our sensitive faculty, Mill says. The faculty of reason allows us to say, for example, quote, there is a law of nature that tells us we ought not to harm others in their life, liberty, health, or possessions. That's a quote from John Locke. I don't instinctively know that an act of forcible rape is morally wrong, but I do intuitively know that the moral rule or principle that obliges us not to perform such acts is true. The intuitive school has much in common with the inductive school, its main opponent. Both schools agree that it is necessary to have general moral laws, and both agree that the morality of an individual action is not a question of direct perception, but of the application of a law to an individual case. Both schools also endorse almost the same set of moral rules. For example, the obligation to tell the truth, the obligation to keep promises, the obligation to refrain from killing or physically harming innocent others, not to steal or damage the possessions of others, to not restrict their liberty. I could go on. But they have the same, these two schools, the intuitive and the inductive, have the same set of rules. The major difference, then, is about how one knows that general laws and principles are true or false. Intuitionists argue that the true principles of morals are known a priori, in the same way that a definition is known to be true. For example, to know that a triangle is a three-sided plane figure, all we need to know is the meaning of the terms in the definition. There's no need to observe or experience triangles. You don't go out and say that the definition is correct because all of the triangles I've seen definitely have three sides. I haven't found a single two-sided triangle. We don't do that. We just say, yeah, that's the definition. We know it by intuition. By analogy, claims the intuitionist, one can know a priori that murder is wrong because the word murder means wrongful killing. One can also know a priori that breaking a promise is wrong because, for example, I promise to meet with you tomorrow is to place myself under a moral obligation to meet with you, so that breaking a promise is to violate the obligation, and this is equivalent to wrongdoing. However, it gets much more complicated for the intuitive school if we move from the level of individual actions to the level of first principles. Thus, to know that there is a universal moral obligation not to kill either oneself or other human beings except in self-defense, it's not clear that we can do this by a simple analysis of the words human being, quote, killing oneself, quote, killing others, quote, and moral obligation, quote. It's not clear that we can put all these terms together and derive an answer to our principle, to our discussion about moral principles. So let's move on, before we get deeper into the intuitive school, to the inductive school. According to the inductive school, right and wrong, as well as truth and falsehood, are questions of observation and experience. Now, Mill doesn't give an example, but we can construct one by assuming that the words right and wrong signify the result of an inductive argument based on observing and measuring the good and bad consequences of human behavior. As Mill will inform us in the next chapter, this can be done if we assume that the word good means pleasure and the word bad just means pain. So if asked whether someone who favors the inductive approach, let me start again, I'm sorry. If asked whether it would be morally right to tell a lie to save a person's life, someone who favors the inductive approach would answer by first calculating the amounts of pleasure and pain that would be caused by telling the lie and compare this to the amounts of pleasure and pain caused by not telling the lie. They would then look to see what course of action would cause a greater balance of pleasure over pain. Observation and experience, Mill says, is all that one would need to make the relevant calculations and thereby to answer the question about right and wrong. Mill concludes this lengthy paragraph that we've just discussed by reminding us that although the intuitive person or school agrees with the inductive school that there is a science of morals, they seldom attempt to make out a list of the a priori principles which are to serve as the premises of the science, either by citing one first principle, or if there are several, telling us which has precedence over the others when they conflict. They just don't go into that. And by the way, I just said the premises of the science. That was a quote from Mill. He clearly means a premise of the philosopher. So let's look at what Mill says is the indispensability of utility-based principles, and I hope Immanuel Kant and his brood of Kantians listen to this. Mill observes that men's sentiments, both of favor and of aversion, are greatly influenced by what they suppose to be the effects of things upon their happiness. This observation should not surprise us. One person is in favor of early morning walks because it makes him happy, while another person is averse to this activity because she would rather sleep in the morning. This explains why the principle of utility, which we're going to find out is known as the greatest happiness principle, why this principle has such a strong effect even on the moral doctrines of those who most scornfully reject its authority. Well, to give one example of the indispensability of utilitarian arguments, Mill turns to the German philosopher Immanuel Kant's first principle of morals. It's called the Categorical Imperative, and it has several versions. The first being, quote, one ought to act only in accordance with a maxim or rule that one can at the same time will to become a universal law. So if I, for example, want to break a promise, I'm thinking about breaking a promise, then I ought to act only in accordance with a maxim, it's okay to break my promises, that I can will to become a universal law. And then to ask the question, do I want to will that as a universal law, that you can just break your promises when you want to? Now, Kant doesn't claim that the categorical imperative can be known to be true merely by analyzing the meaning of its terms. Instead, he argues that if we want to discover whether an act ought to be done, we must act whether a person could will, without contradiction, that everyone adopt the rule on which we are acting. That's the thing that I was just talking about, becoming a universal law. So Kant uses the example of a lying promise. Let's look at this. Suppose you are a poor college student who is living in a dorm room with another student who is wealthy. You don't have enough money to pay tuition for the next semester. You're broke. So you ask your rich roommate for a loan. He agrees to loan you the money, but only if you promise to repay him by the end of the semester. Well, you know that you cannot keep this promise, but you go ahead and you make the promise anyway. That's what Kant calls a lying promise. It is wrong to make a lying promise because, Kant writes, it is logically impossible to will that maxim that it is permissible to make a lying promise whenever one needs to borrow money or to escape any other difficulty. When the lying promise was made, your aim in making it was to convince your roommate that you would repay the loan. You wanted him or her to credit your promise. But if everyone else made lying promises under the same circumstances, then no one would believe that promises would be kept. The liar could not consistently will that his maxim become a universal law because this would frustrate his own aim in making the lying promise. Therefore, Kant concludes that one ought not to escape a difficulty, needing the money for tuition, by making a lying promise. Now, Mill takes issue with Kant's reasoning about the a priori status of the categorical imperative. Mill doesn't think that there would be any contradiction, any logical impossibility in the adoption by all rational beings of the most outrageously immoral rules of conduct. Instead, Mill goes on to say, all that he, Kant, shows is that the consequences of their universal adoption would be such as no one would choose to incur, proving Mill's initial point that appeals to utility are just indispensable. He thinks that what Kant is doing is just saying that, well, it can't become a universal law because the consequences of that universal adoption by everyone would be such as no one would choose to incur it. There's no other way that he is saying, that you can avoid talking about consequences when you talk about morality. Mill announces that his aim in utilitarianism is to help his readers understand and appreciate the utilitarian theory. And he wants to contribute something towards such proof as it is susceptible of. He cautions his readers that the proof of the theory will not be direct, because questions of ultimate ends are not amenable to direct proof. If it is said that something is good, then it is assumed that this is so because it is a means to something else that is good, or it is good in itself. For example, if you go to the opera because you find it enjoyable, and I ask you why you seek enjoyment, you would understandably wonder whether I'm joking. Enjoyment is an ultimate end, and as such it can't be proved. If you must go to the dentist to have an infected tooth pulled, it makes sense to say that this is good, but only because it's a means to the relief of your tooth pain. If we further ask, why do you want your pain relieved? You wouldn't have an answer. The question is crazy. The relief of pain is an ultimate end, and as an ultimate end, there is, by definition, no way to directly prove that this end is good. It just is good. And here's what Mill says. If then it is asserted that there is a comprehensive formula, including all things which are in themselves good, and that whatever else is good is not so as an end but as a means, the formula may be accepted or rejected, but it's not a subject of what is commonly understood by proof. But fear not. Mill rescues us from the despair of making an arbitrary choice of one comprehensive formula over another, and he does this by proposing what he says is a larger meaning of the word proof, a meaning of this word that we can all understand. And here's what he says. Considerations may be presented capable of determining the intellect either to give or withhold assent to the doctrine, and this is equivalent to proof. Well, what are these considerations, these mysterious considerations of which Mill talks? He says we can prove something by giving considerations that are capable of determining the intellect to give or withhold assent to the doctrine. That sounds very, very subjective, doesn't it? Your considerations might be different from mine. So what are these considerations Mill is talking about? Whose intellect should we consult? What if my intellect gives consent to the doctrine and yours doesn't? Mill doesn't answer these questions, unfortunately, until chapter 4 of the book that I'm now reading from. So that's all for now. I'm about to say goodbye, but I want to remind you that I have 2 other podcasts which are already completed. There's Understanding Plato, in which I discuss Plato's Republic and the Socratic dialogues of Plato. And there is Understanding John Locke, in which I discuss his famous Second Treatise of Government. Both of those can be heard at your favorite podcast. I'm podcasting from a particular place, Spreaker it's called, S-P-R, not Speaker, Spreaker, S-P-R-E-A-K-E-R. You can go there and listen to it. But they distribute it to lots of other places. And I'm sure that almost any of the podcasts people that you found a good one to listen to. So if you want, go and listen to those podcasts. If they help you in your studies, if they help you in your understanding, I would be just delighted. This podcast is, this episode is being broadcast on a Monday. And the next episode, episode 3, will be next Monday. So thank you for listening.